Matt and Mike in the morning. Welcome back to Matt and Mike in the morning. This is the Old Testament lesson, lesson 4, to be taught on October the 9th. We have a lot of history here. So we go all the way from Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden. We get Cain and Abel, we get Noah and the flood, and we get the Tower of Babel. This is at least several hundred years worth of human history in these 3 highlighted stories. There's quite a bit going on. So we left off last time with Adam and Eve falling into sin, and now we see the effects of that. We don't see it in this lesson, but we see in Genesis 5 that the effects is that you have this whole genealogy of so and so lived for so many years. He had this kid lived for so many years, and then he died. And then next guy so many years, and then he died. And over again, we see the consequence of death. Arising from, the guilt of sin. And it starts off with Cain and Abel bringing their offerings to God. What do you want to say about this?
So the theme that is written in this book for this lesson is God uses the power of nature to judge man's wickedness, kind of centered around, the flood and the cataclysmic event that is. But there's more to the narrative. You're supposed to cover Genesis chapter 4 all the way through Genesis chapter 11. Like you said,
right.
A few, 1,000 years at least worth of history there. And there's so much significance in all of these chapters in Genesis. But I think that the lesson does a nice job of just sort of hitting the high points. But I would maybe say the theme of this lesson revolves more around faith and obedience compared to God's judgment on no faith and disobedience. Mm-hmm. Because you see judgment come with the story of Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. You see Cain offer a gift without faith and not obedience either. Abel does have a gift in faith. And so Cain gets all upset about that and he kills his brother. And so there's judgment laid upon Cain, but the judgment there is that he's marked. There's a great gospel message in this, which is kind of maybe deep to bring out at this age group, but he's marked with a sign so that other people wouldn't kill him.
Right.
Yeah, so he's marked with a sign really of life, and there's a wonderful parallel to the mark, to the sign of holy baptism that we are marked with. So the devil cannot claim us. He cannot take us down to Sheol, to the grave, sure. Because we're marked by God with his name for holiness. Then you get the story of the account of Noah and the flood, where the intent of man's heart was only evil all the time, as Genesis said. So there's great sin, great disobedience, no faith except for the 8 people, Noah and his family, 8 souls on the ark, and then how they are preserved by God's action of judgment upon the earth. And then later on, the account wraps up, at least this lesson does, with this Tower of Babel, where once again there is not faith upon the plains of the earth, and they build a big tower in the plains of Shinar because they think, well, we can control God by getting up there to tell him what to do. And so there's a lack of faith and great disobedience, and then the Lord brings judgment upon them again as he confuses them and spreads them out. But there's also sort of like a deliverance in him spreading them out over the face of the earth. One would probably be so they just wouldn't kill each other, but also that they would, have dominion over the earth and subdue it, as he gave to Adam and Eve in the garden, but then they didn't. And then through these people groups, they're sent out, but then they're brought back in by the message of the prophets and the coming of the Christ child. So there's just a whole bunch to get through this lesson. They have this emphasis upon the numbers. I don't know how much it's really going to stick with the kids. If they like numbers, you can do that. But I might suggest maybe just like picking one facet of this lesson and looking into that a little bit more. If it's a story of Cain and Abel, if it's an account of the flood, or if it's the Tower of Babel, maybe just focus on that, because I think it's just too much to get in a short period of time.
Yeah. If there are any questions that you might get about Cain and Abel, it would probably be, how do they know that the Lord had a regard for Abel and his sacrifice, but not for Cain's? Well, it was probably one of two things. Either there was some kind of visible sign, like they offered, they offer these on an altar and burn them up, and somehow God, sent a flame to burn up the sacrifice of animals, something like that, maybe some kind of visible sign, or else that they were both asking for things, and the Lord fulfilled Abel's request, but not Cain's. So that Abel offered a sacrifice in faith, and then he got what he was asking for, and Cain offered a sacrifice apart from faith, and he didn't get what I was asking for. Those are the two likeliest answers for how they knew that the Lord had regard for one offering but not the other. So what it looks like to be faithful in the story of Cain and Abel is that Cain offers a sacrifice of animals. This might be linked back in Genesis chapter 3. The Lord killed an animal in order to cover Adam and Eve with a skin of an animal. Right? In order to cover them, well, an animal had to die. I would bet that it was a lamb, but that's just me. Just for the symbolism coming forward into the New Testament. But so the Lord kills an animal and says, this covers your guilt and your shame. This clothes you to cover your guilt and your shame. Well, then Abel goes and offers an animal sacrifice as well. But not only that, it's also not just any old animal, but it's the richest, it's the fattest offering, the best offering that you can give. And it was offered in faith, trusting God's promises. Whereas in some way, Cain's was not. Whether it was the type of offering or really in the end, it was offered from a lack of faith. When you get to the story of Noah, well, what it means to be faithful is that Noah was righteous in the eyes of the Lord before he ever built the ark. He simply trusted God's promises, unlike the rest of the people who were so wicked that God was sorry that he made humanity. I can't even imagine looking at my kids and saying, wow, I'm sorry that we actually had you. And yet that's how much the Lord is grieved over the wickedness of his people that he made perfect, right? And so to be faithful is to trust God's promises and follow God's lead when he says, make an ark and I'm going to save you. When it comes to the Tower of Babel, well, there's his faithlessness all around. God said, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And they say, we're going to stay right here and we're going to build a name for ourselves. It doesn't go well. And so the Lord confuses their language. He spreads them out. And then we see a few generations after this that the Lord calls Abram. Out of the midst of all these people that are nobodies, essentially, the Lord calls Abram. And he makes him into a great nation. We'll get that next week on Matt and Mike in the morning.